Would you sell your soul to repay someone who helped you in an hour of need? Mafia The Old Country is a game I was not planning on picking up. The idea of turning back the clock, taking the series back to Italy, that had me mildly interested, but then they released that trailer with the scene in which the characters light on fire a holy card depicting the Madonna and Child, to which my reaction was, well, to hell with this game. Guess I won't be playing that. After the release, however, I caught a glimpse of the full cutscene, in which only the corner of the image is burned, and the situation is put in its full context. The context of a vow. My flesh must burn like this saint if I do not keep my oath, which immediately brings to mind covenant sacrifices in the Old Testament. One of the reasons for sacrificing animals in the ancient world was to seal a pact or covenant. When you slaughtered a sacrificial ram, for instance, you were saying, if I ever go back on my word and break this covenant, then what happens to this animal, let that happen to me. It was a means of making public a sacred vow. And this mafia initiation ritual carries a similar meaning. But it also serves to show just how far our protagonist has fallen. He's moved up in the world, but his moral standards have sunk pretty low. And Enzo was not always like this. In the story's opening chapter, he even appears to have a childlike devotion to Our Lady. There are times when he prays, and he spends a good chunk of the game with a cross dangling from around his neck. The Old Country definitely doesn't hide Catholicism's role in Italian culture at that time. But when Enzo's bleak life of working the mines, when it goes from bad to worse, it's not an angel of the Lord who shows up to save him, it's Don Torrisi. What follows from there is a predictable but competently told tale of organized crime. To say that Mafia The Old Country is a narratively driven game would be putting it extremely lightly. If you're a big fan of Rockstar-style storytelling in which you travel from point A to point B while listening to expository banter, and your ability to sprint or spur on your horse is taken away, then you are in luck. A whole lot of your time here will be spent either watching cutscenes or doing the whole travel and talk kind of thing. There's a sizable and stunning open world. The previews really did not do justice to just how breathtaking this slice of Sicily can be. But it's mostly just there for the vibes. There's not much to actually interact with, and you'll go for long stretches in which, even if you wanted to explore, you're basically just being shuttled from one main story mission to the next. And I suppose that's one way to solve the old dilemma of how do we have an open world and still preserve a sense of urgency with the plot. However, it would work better if the main story missions had a little more meat on them in the gameplay department. In many ways, The Old Country reminds me of the recent Indiana Jones game. That title also excelled in its presentation, but had fairly simplistic combat and stealth. Mafia takes that even further in its bare-bones approach. You won't find Indy's Tomb Raider-style platforming puzzles, but you will find a decent amount of combat, both with guns and knives, plus a generous helping of stealth and several racing sections. Again, it's not totally brainless, but you do really need to crank up the difficulty if you want aspects such as the stealth to feel like more than baby's first stealth game. It honestly doesn't bother me that several sections feature mandatory stealth. I just want the sneaking to feel satisfying. On the brighter side, the music matches the impressive quality of the visuals, and several of the performances are quite good. Also, this may be the first game in which you upgrade your abilities by adding custom beads to your rosary. But that takes us back to the theological and moral messages here. Many like to draw a link between crime and poverty, or sin and just desperate situations. Free will sounds nice and all, but when a person is pushed to the limit, how much culpability do they really have? The Christian stance is that your environment can certainly influence your decisions. It may reduce the weight of that culpability, but it does not erase it. To say that your choices are influenced is not to say that they are determined. I could probably do a whole video just on that dynamic alone, and maybe I will at some point. But in this game, the environmental pressure looms largest in the opening act. We can sympathize with those tragic experiences which set Enzo off on his criminal path. But the farther he walks down that path, the harder it becomes to make excuses for his actions. I've mentioned before that if you want to make people root for the bad guy, one tried and true technique is to fill your world with other bad guys who are even worse, who are so evil that they make your bad guy protagonist look good by comparison. This game definitely does that, and also humanizes Enzo with another predictable but decently told love story. A forbidden love with the daughter of the Don who saved you. And so, for many of those first missions, even if you're doing not so good things, you still feel like one of the good guys. Your enemies, they're no saints. They've probably got it coming. Yet from those first small sins, things eventually snowball in a way that should give the player pause. The old slippery slope argument is one which gets a lot of flack from modern thinkers. As the saying goes, it's all too often been proven true, therefore it must be false. Essentially, as we ignore or normalize acts which are only slightly evil, it becomes easier and easier to excuse more gravely evil actions, until for our society, or we ourselves, there remains almost no level of evil that we cannot conjure up a reason to justify. I won't be giving away any significant spoilers, but in The Old Country, there were several moments which stood out to me as lines in the sand. The first time when Enzo is handed a gun, and it's made clear that he's not just heading out to threaten someone or to rough them up. There's a weight to that scene as he stares at his firearm, reflecting on what he's about to do. Though the impact is dulled somewhat by the fact that only minutes later, you'll be blasting away tons of dudes like it's nothing. But at least those bandits were shooting back. Another scene unfolds later, where you have to prove your loyalty by executing an enemy of the family, despite him being unarmed and begging for his life. It's presented as a choice, but if, like me, you refuse to pull the trigger in order to see what happens, well, you'll just end up dead and then restarting back at the previous checkpoint. Still, even in that case, this was at least a fellow who previously threatened people's lives, including the life of the woman you love. And it's not like you haven't already killed a bunch of people by this point in the narrative. One of the weightier story beats hits just shortly after you've become a made man, and you finally move up from living in a dingy one-room cell to having your own villa. As you're given the tour, however, there's a haunting moment in which you recognize the not-so-subtle clues that this villa very recently belonged to someone else. There's a half-eaten meal on the table, worn clothes in the closet, a scribbled note to a family member, and a spatter of blood on the tiled floor. You've made it. You've got your own place. But there was a price to be paid. Someone else paid with their blood. You paid with your soul. Was the previous resident a dangerous criminal or a threat to the family? Maybe, but maybe not. By this point in the tale, would Enzo even care? That disquieting moment passes, and the story barrels on. But again, despite having moved up massively in the world, going from virtual slavery to being someone feared and respected, is Enzo really better off? Had he died when that mine shaft caved in, I don't think that heaven would have been a distant hope. But it sure looks distant now. And it all started with a good-hearted desire to repay someone who was indeed there for him in his darkest hour. Some small sins led to bigger ones, and now Enzo is a man for whom blood is cheap, unless it is the blood of the family. Though, like all such groups in which faithfulness to a code trumps faithfulness to God, it may happen that not everyone in the family equally values that bond of loyalty. There is always a slope. We are always moving either closer to God or drifting farther away. Do we recognize which way each new choice is taking us? And that's all I've got for today. May you go with God. May you like and subscribe. And may we pray for one another until we meet again.